A company decides that it wants to change its fiscal year end. How does it proceed today on Zippy Point? I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. So maybe your company wants to change its fiscal year end to make it easier to wind up the books at the end of the year to better match the planning cycles of the company's customers. Or maybe it's to match what other companies do within that particular industry. Some industries have common fiscal year ends. For example, the retail industry, most companies end their fiscal year on January 31st. The holiday seasons, when they make all their money, they're real busy because they're bringing in all their revenue. And so 1/31 is the end of their fiscal year. And then some other companies just want to do what all the other companies do. Most companies have fiscal year ends of 12/31. So here's an example of a company that changed its fiscal year end because that's what all the other New York Stock Exchange listed companies do. Or maybe your company did a reverse merger so that the company winds up with a fiscal year change. That happens. So here are 5 things that you should know when you're changing your fiscal year end. 1, decide whether you need shareholder approval. 2, decide what type of transition report you need to file with the SEC. 3, decide what financials are required. 4, file an item 5.03 Form 8K with the SEC. And 5, consider collateral consequences. 1, decide whether you need shareholder approval. So it's unlikely, but it does happen. Check your charter and bylaws, the state law in which your company is incorporated, to determine whether you need shareholder approval solely for approval of a voluntary change of its fiscal year. Under your state law, it's likely that the board must determine that a change in fiscal year is in the best interest of shareholders. So the board has to make that analysis, and then the board approves that in a board resolution. 2, decide what type of transition report you need to file with the SEC. When you change your fiscal year, you must file a transition report with the SEC. You're filing financials covering the period between the close of the most recent fiscal year and the start of this new fiscal year, the transition period, to fill what otherwise would be a gap in your financial reporting. So you have 2 options here. One type of transition report, it would be on a Form 10K. The other type of transition report would be on a Form 10Q. And in some cases, you don't need a transition report at all, as we're going to discuss. The option you choose will depend on the length of the transition period. See Rules 13A10 and 15D10 of the Exchange Act to help me make your analysis. When you change your fiscal year and file one of these transition reports, you're going to check that box on the Form 10K or 10Q's cover page way up at the top that you always wonder why it said annual report or transition report or quarterly report or transition report. You always wondered what that was all about. Then you're going to fill out the 10K or the 10Qs like you normally would. You're going to comply with all the SK requirements. You're going to include your Section 302 CEO, CFO certifications for all your transition reports. And you're going to include a 906 certification, a set of them, if there are financials involved. 10Ks would include a management report on internal controls, and the compensation disclosure that otherwise would be in a proxy statement would be this for the stub period in the 3 last fiscal years. You include compensation disclosure for the NEOs who were employed during the transition period and who earned more than $100,000 during the prior 12-month period. You don't need to include information for any new NEOs hired during the stub period who made less than $100K. Other than that, there really is nothing magical or special about what is disclosed in a transition report in terms of explaining why the transition happened or anything like that. That's going to be covered when you file an 8K about the transition to a new fiscal year, like we're going to talk about that in a second. But a company might want to explain to shareholders if in case you think shareholders are going to have any questions about what you're doing. So you might have some sort of explanatory language in your transition report. But otherwise, a 10K or 10Q is pretty straightforward, just like any other periodic report. So here's an example of a transition report filed on a 10K. The index says it's a transition report, but otherwise there really is little mention of it other than in the financials. So let's now talk about the financials that you're going to need to include and then your transition period deadline. That's going to depend on what type of filer you are. A large accelerated filer, an accelerated filer, a non-accelerated filer. So if your transition period is 6 months or more, Rule 13A10B is what you're going to look at. The transition financials must be audited, and the deadline depends, like I said, on the type of filer you are. There you're going to look at Rule 13A10J1. If the company is a non-accelerated filer, you get 90 days. accelerated filer, 75 days. And for a large accelerated filer, you're going to get 60 days after the later of the election to change the fiscal year or the end of the transition period. And then if your transition period is less than 6 months, you're going to look at Rule 13810C. There it talks about the transition period financials being audited if you're using a 10K, but can be unaudited if it's filed on a 10Q, and the deadline varies again on the type of filer you are. Here you're going to look at Rule 13810J2, and if it's a non-accelerated filer, you get 45 days for the 10Q, and if it's an accelerated or a large accelerated filer, you're going to get 40 days after the later of the election to change the fiscal year or the end of the transition period. And then you look at Rule 13810D if the transition period is 1 month or less. No separate transition report is required in this instance. The transition period financials then can be unaudited, and then the next 10K would include audited periods for the transition period. And if the company decides not to file a separate transition report on 10Q is allowed, then it must include transition period financials in the next 10Q that it files. So here's an example. Here's an 8K announcing that if the fiscal year end has changed by a period of 1 month. Here's the related press release. And then here's that 10Q, and the only mention of the fiscal year end change is in the financials, and the same thing with the next 10K that this company filed. The only mention of the fiscal year change is in the financials. There's no other language about it. The cover page doesn't mention that it's a transition report because it's not. The company elected not to file one. Let's do a sort of a little bit of a sidebar. There's another scenario where no transition report is required. Sometimes companies change their fiscal year from a calendar year to, or from, a 52 or a 53 week fiscal year. So then each quarter is 13 weeks if you have a 52 week fiscal year. A transition report is now required because a change from a fiscal year ending as of the last day of the month to a 52, 53 week fiscal year commencing within 7 days of the month end or vice versa is not deemed to be a change in the fiscal year end if the new fiscal year commences with the end of the old fiscal year. And item 503-8K is required, as noted in this CorpFin staff interpretation. And these 8Ks tend to be pretty detailed, more involved than the other 8Ks filed when companies change their fiscal year end. So let's look at an example for one of these 8Ks that is a little bit more, is quite a bit more detailed. And here's one for Blooming Brands. And you can see that there's a couple of charts here noting the change in the fiscal periods, the reporting periods, and what kind of SEC filing will be required. And then there's analysis of how the impact on the financials. This 8K is still not too detailed, but as you'll see, compared to other 8Ks announcing fiscal year ends, it's more detailed and there's definitely more data provided. 3, decide what goes in the financials. So already talked about when you need audited or unaudited financials, depending on whether you're filing a 10K or 10Q and what the time period is involved. And here you want to check out CorpFin's financial reporting manual, particularly sections 1360 and 1365 for guidance. Of course, your accountants, your auditors are going to help you figure all this out, because they're going to decide what goes in the financials. But it would be useful if you read this too, so that you know what's going on. So you want to read the financial reporting manual pretty closely, but know that transition reports must include prior year information comparable to the transition period. That comparable year information may be unaudited and may be provided on a condensed basis and in the footnotes to the financials instead of as separate statements. And in the process, you might wind up recasting your prior financials in subsequent 10Ks to conform with the newly adopted fiscal year, but that's not required. So 4, file a item 503 Form K with the SEC. Unless the change in the fiscal year will be subject to a shareholder vote, which is unlikely, as I mentioned earlier, a Form 8K under item 503B must be filed within 4 business days of the date of the determination that the fiscal year end is going to change, and it must include 3 pieces of disclosure. The data, 1 is the date of the determination to change the fiscal year, 2, what is your new fiscal year end, and 3, what type of transition report you intend to file. Is it going to be a 10Q or is it going to be a 10K? Or if it's less than a month, you'll say that there's going to be no transition report at all. That's what you decide to do. Note that if a change in fiscal year is affected by an amendment of the company's charter or bylaws, the 8K is filed under item 503A instead of 503B. So here's an example of what one of these 503B 8Ks look like. And as you can see, it's pretty straightforward, 1 paragraph 8K. 5, consider collateral consequences. So changing the fiscal year end can be expensive. That's why you don't see it done that often. Also, you don't see it done that often because companies typically don't need to do it. But there are lots of consequences that are not securities law, not governance related. So changing your tax year, for example, to match your financial reporting year. But there are other securities law and governance things to consider too. You may need to change your traditional annual meeting time period, obviously. That depends on how far you're moving the fiscal year end. You're going to check your state law for this. Delaware law requires that an annual meeting be held at least once every 13 months. The stock exchange rules also might come into play. They traditionally require one annual meeting per year if you're listed on the NYSE or NASDAQ. And if you're changing your annual meeting date, you're going to have to give notice to potential shareholder proponents to let them know what the new deadline is for them to submit shareholder proposals to you. So here's an 8K giving this type of disclosure, indicating when the new deadline is for shareholder proposals. If you're also changing the fiscal year end for ERISA plans, if you have any, so that it matches what your company's fiscal year end, you'll need to file a short year Form 11K for that plan. And then the last thing is to consider your company's filing status. It might change as a result of the change in your fiscal year. So you'll need to make that non-accelerated, accelerated, large accelerated filer analysis based on the public float as of the last business day of what would have been the most recently completed second quarter if the close of the transition period were the end of a full fiscal year end. So it's a 6-month look back. Anyways, let me know what you think.